Chile is headed for a contentious presidential election runoff next month as hard-right former Congressman Jose Antonio Kast finished on top in the first-round vote on Sunday ahead of leftist lawmaker and former protest leader Gabriel Boric. With roughly 90% of the vote counted, Kast came in with 28% of ballots cast compared to 25.64% for Boric, with a sizable gap between them and the rest of the field of more moderate center-right candidates far behind, although both Kast and Boric were well short of the majority needed to win outright. The Chilean-American author Ariel Dorfman describes the contest in a recent LA Times op-ed as, quote, confronted by a stark choice between the dreadful past and a still-to-be-charted future, and grappling with the discontents and challenges facing so many countries, including the United States. What will Chile decide? Here with us to discuss is Hill reporter Rafael Bernal. Welcome, Rafael.
Thanks for having me.
So I was describing this to a rising producer as a very rising result. You know, the far left and far right emerging into the runoff, with the centrist candidates all collapsing and falling far behind. Did this surprise people down in Chile, or were you expecting that it would be these two candidates moving into the runoff?
Well, it's surprising in that since the formal end of the dictatorship in 1991, the center left and center right have sort of traded spaces. Chile has been a very centrist country, it's built really strong democratic institutions. So we've never really had an election in Chile where the runoff is between two very partisan, very fringe candidates. Now, the one thing that's very surprising about Kast is he's unapologetically right-wing in a country that had a 15-year, very right-wing, very human rights failed dictatorship, and he's running against Boric, who is, I guess the opposite would be, he's a bit of an apologetic leftist. He is not the communist that Kast is trying to make him out to be.
And so what is likely to happen now? So explain to us, so there's going to be a runoff election just between those two top candidates, and does the elimination of other candidates, how does that make it more likely which will come out on top?
Right. So since nobody got to 50%, they have a runoff in 3 weeks. That's a pretty common system throughout the presidential systems in South America specifically. In that runoff, these are the only two candidates that are allowed to run. There were more center-right candidates running who got any substantial portion of the vote, 15s and 12%. So that's around where other candidates landed. So Kast sort of has the inside lane. Boric is trying to sort of call out to a certain unity, but they're both fighting ghosts of the past, because the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, the far right dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, came as a result of the election of the far left Salvador Allende in 1973. You know, that was the coup that was against sort of this idea of communist rule, even though Allende wasn't necessarily a communist. There's a lot of debate about that. So both candidates now are sort of ghosts of the past. And more importantly, this comes as the National Assembly is redrafting Chile's constitution, because Chile's constitution was essentially written by Pinochet as a way for him to retire peacefully, unlike most other dictators. And he did. And so it's sort of a dictatorship era constitution. And now it's sort of in question, like, what sort of society will Chileans be?
There seem to be some echoes of Bolsonaro in Brazil going on here, in the sense that Bolsonaro unapologetically refers back to that country's military dictatorship, all of the brutality, disappearances, torture that went with it, in a positive way, and says, like, this is what we need here in Brazil. We need to restore the strength of the military dictatorship. And you've had Kast, speak positively about the Pinochet era as well, which only ended, as you said, 1990. And so, even Boric, who was only 35, would have been born during the Pinochet era. Most Chileans were alive during the Pinochet era, and the idea that somebody would be romanticizing it or celebrating it sounds rather shocking, but we already know that Bolsonaro could do that with the Brazilian dictatorship and still win. So is that not a electoral liability for Kast?
Well, it sort of helps him. Kast is no Bolsonaro in the sense that he's sort of a well-studied, well-mannered, quieter individual. He is a Bolsonaro in the sense of what you're pointing out. He does speak well of the dictatorship. He especially speaks well of it in an economic, the economic standards that it set up. And that's sort of a loophole for many Chileans. Many Chileans believe that Chile was headed to be just another Latin American country with the problems that usually plague Latin American countries, and the dictatorship sort of like cleaned up its act and was necessary to then become Latin America's leading democracy, and in many ways its most developed economy, or its most developed large economy anyway. And that's a thought that I'm sure Kast is aware of. Boric is also aware of it, but it's something to campaign on. It's it has not been politically used in the past because of the human rights abuses of the Pinochet era, which apparently are, it's sort of a balance there. The economic infrastructure that was left by Pinochet is apparently in the minds of some voters, of 28% of Chilean voters anyway, outweighing the pain of the human rights violations.
Is Boric expected to, moderate his message or court some of those center-right candidates who were knocked out in order to, extend or expand his kind of coalition?
It seems like he already is. The speeches last night, Kast, doubled down on his "I am who I am" and unapologetic right message. Boric sort of slowed down a little bit. He needs to get out of this guy is communism, or he needs to get out from under the specter of Salvador Allende, who, yes, many Chileans on the left love, but many Chileans on the center and on the right, fear. They believe Salvador Allende wanted to turn Chile into a Cuban-style communist regime. So he needs to drop that. So he needs to be apologetic while running against an unapologetic candidate, and that in itself is a challenge.
And he comes out of a student movement. Can you talk a little bit about what that student movement was and what his politics are?
Well, the student movement in Chile has been repressed oftentimes by the very democratic governments. Nobody doubts the democratic credentials of the Chilean governments of at least the last decade, if not the last 2 or 3. But they have been repressed. There's been police. There's a lot of images of police tanks firing water cannons at student protesters. The latest round of protests was in 2019. And they've been asking, the typical student things, cheaper tuition, more opportunities, more work opportunities. And his politics are certainly leftist, and he's very anti-neoliberal. He's very much of the belief. He said that if neoliberalism was invented in Chile, which could possibly be, we should also bury it in Chile. That's sort of his message. And it's a message that's resonated, but again, among a quarter of the population, and it remains to be seen, whose message scares off more people in the center. As we said, right now it looks like Kast has the inside track.
Yeah. Rafael Bernal, we really appreciate you giving your expertise here.
I appreciate you having me.
Thank you, and we'll be back with more Rising in just a minute.